All right, welcome everyone today. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who aren't familiar with Oldways, we are a nonprofit nutrition education organization whose mission is to inspire people to embrace the healthy and sustainable joys of the old ways of cooking and eating. So heritage-based diets, high in taste, nourishment, sustainability, and joy. Since 1990, we have helped people live healthier, happier lives by offering educational programs, resources, and recipes based on shared cultural food traditions from around the world. So just a few housekeeping notes about today's webinar. Yes, this is being recorded. We will share both the recording and the slides with you within 1 week of this webinar concluding. You can also find the recording and slides. They'll be posted to our website. So if you visit oldwayspt.org and you click on CPEU Library in the top right-hand corner, then you can find that there as well, in addition to links to register for upcoming webinars, such as another one we're having tomorrow. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So we kindly ask that you submit any questions using the chat function, typing it into the chat box rather than the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. We are so grateful to Unilever for sponsoring this session, and we're really excited about the fantastic speakers we have lined up for you today. The first person who will be presenting is Alex White. Alex is the Product Development R&D Lead and Lead Tea Taster for Unilever North America. He has 20 years with the company and has worked in R&D across foods and beverage in Europe and North America. He currently manages the innovation program for Lipton, Tazo, Puka, and Pure Leaf in the US and Canada, and also serves as the region's operational tea taster, blender, and tea expertise point of reference. Alex grew up in a very multicultural environment, living and loving different countries and speaking several languages. His educational background as a biochemist from the University of Leeds, UK, with a personal passion for foods, herbs, plants, and tea. Our second presenter today will be Joy DeBow. She is the head of Nutrition and Health North America at Unilever. Dr. DeBow is engaged with setting the short and long-term nutrition strategic direction for all foods and refreshment categories and brands in North America, ensuring alignment with the global nutrition agenda. She is responsible for leveraging public and private sector partners, engaging with key federal agencies, and leading outreach to key opinion formers to ultimately improve nutrition and public health in America. She is also a registered dietitian. And then our final speaker today will be Dr. Taylor Wallace. He is principal and CEO at the Think Healthy Group and an adjunct professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at George Mason University. His academic research interests are in the area of nutritional interventions to promote health and prevent the onset of chronic disease. He has a PhD and MS in food science and nutrition from The Ohio State University and a BS in food science from the University of Kentucky. And he also has a wonderful blog called drtaylorwallace.com and a radio show called Risky Behavior. And he's also frequently quoted in the media as well. So I'm excited for you all to get to know these panelists better. And with that, I will hand it over to Alex White to begin.
Yes, greeting everybody. I will try and share my screen. Okay, thanks for the introduction, Sarah. As you mentioned, I have spent 20 years of my career in Unilever, currently the biggest tea company in the world, and working directly with some of the brands that were mentioned: Tazo, Lipton, Paka, Pure Leaf, PG Tips, etc. I guess what really attracted me to tea is really the backdrop of lore, of historical context and legends that's behind it. I don't think there's any other category that has quite so much richness in stories and millennial tradition, to the point that over the centuries, it's really expanded across the globe in so many different rich traditional ways and rituals and preparations, presentations, way of consuming tea. So it's a very colorful category and really deeply rooted and embedded in our social fabric. And even in a context like in the US, where there's prevalently a coffee culture, tea is really very important, and there's a staggering number of people drinking tea every day, over 130 million, in fact, on any given day, on any given day, according to my latest stats. And with the peculiarity in this region that most of it is consumed as ice. So compared to the rest of the globe, that's a feature that's very peculiar to the US. So when we talk of tea, we talk of two main sort of broad categories, right? What we call true tea, which comes from a plant called Camellia sinensis. And then there's a whole range of botanicals or herbals or tisanes or whatever you want to call them, but they're relating to a whole spectrum of other plants, right? So for the purpose of the topic of today, we will focus on true tea, so anything that comes from Camellia sinensis, which is a plant of the Camellia family. And here are a few pictures of how it looks during the course of its maturation, right? A tea plant will start to be productive around the 3rd, 4th, 5th year sometimes. So it takes a while before a tea plantation gets commercially viable. It loves certain specific conditions, alkali soils. It likes really well drained soils. So typically on the side of elevations and mountains, it does pretty well. It needs a lot of rain, sunshine, like most of plants, and grows. Even in New Jersey, this is a picture of my greenhouse. We managed to sort of get them to thrive a little bit with those conditions. Commercially, it's propagated either by seed or by cuttings, both of which have a separate set of benefits and advantages. And as I mentioned, it's a unique plant. It's one plant that generates many types of teas that are traditionally known as white tea, green tea, oolong tea, black tea, yellow tea, pu'er, matcha, and so forth. So all of these end products originate from this single plant. And then on top of that, there's a series of flavored applications as well. Some of the more traditional ones and most known ones are chai, for example, where certain spices are added to the tea leaf, or Earl Grey, where bergamot oils are typically added for that citrusy flavor, or even jasmine tea, where the tea is combined with jasmine flowers to give that very scented profile. And so all of this variety of end products really sort of stems on three fundamental variables, right? And we'll go into each one a little bit more into detail, but they stem from where the tea plants are grown, how they are picked or harvested, and finally how they're processed. So those are the three main variables that determine this apparent big difference in flavors. And so in terms of origin and where they are grown, tea estates are nestled in beautiful locations across the globe, and not unlike wine, I guess, you can talk about terroirs, right? So all the variables in soil chemistry, in elevation, in precipitation rates, all of those contribute into very specific sensorials coming from each of these proveniences. So, just as a pictorial example, I guess that the bottom right picture with that really red soil, that's a picture of the soil in Malawi. So rich in these metal oxides, copper oxides, et cetera, and they almost sort of translate into the leaf itself. The Malawi teas are very well known for delivering a really red brew and sort of sought after to contribute to color in a blend. Plants that are grown at an elevation typically sort of take longer to mature, have more chance to concentrate some of the phytochemicals into the shoots, and typically display very, very aromatic profiles, for example. So those are a couple of examples on how the terroir can really influence the end product. This is a map of where most of the tea is grown. I think by far the biggest producer in the world is China, followed by India, but both regions are also, satisfying a lot of their domestic usage. They're the big consumption areas of the world. So a lot of what is produced is actually consumed locally, and so the net export is important, but a lot of it gets consumed locally. So following those two origins, we have Sri Lanka and Kenya, who are more important in terms of exports, I guess. And then particularly, I think relevant to this region, to the US, is Argentina as an origin, because as we'll see, the Argentinian tea has some very specific qualities that make it quite suitable to iced tea consumption. And we mentioned earlier on that is the prevalent way that tea is consumed in the US. So as you can see, the tea grows in, it grows at its best around the equator, where it's, a 12-month crop, but, extends to the tropics, and the further extends from the equator, the more seasonal it becomes. So in the Northern Hemisphere, a typical season would be April to October, and it's the other way around in the southern one. Elevation, as we said, plays a big role in defining the sensorial profiles of tea. And broadly speaking, the higher up in elevation, the more aromatic the tea will be, but maybe a little bit thinner, a little less colory. And the further down, the thicker, the more mouthfeely the tea will be, the more colored the tea will be, but lacking a little bit of the head notes. So again, another variable that plays into the terroir. And so just a little example on how these regional differences can play in how we develop tea blends. So you can take all the different characteristics from the different regions and combine them to deliver sort of the desired effect. So here I'm bringing an example from a very typical iced tea blend, as you would find on your supermarket shelf. As we said, Argentina might be the backbone of it because it provides certain elements of mellowness, of clarity, and sparkle, transparency, lack of sedimentation, a lack of bitterness, lack of astringency. So if you want a little bit less flavorful, a little bit less aromatic, but very gulpable, for lack of better terms. So that might be the backbone of the iced tea, and then you would add the Malawi as a contributor to color. So it would give those red hues that we were discussing earlier on. And then maybe, to prop up a little bit more of the flavor, you might want to include some high-grown Kenyan tea to deliver that brisky effect. So it's a very simple sort of example, but I just wanted to show how the different proveniences play into the end result of the blend. So the second big variable in defining tea tea quality, tea sensorials, is the way it's harvested. So tea harvesting is done both by hand and in some cases it's mechanized as well. It really depends on what the desired outcome is. So the part that gets harvested from the tea bush is the new growth. It's the shoots that stem from the plant after its dormancy period in the winter. And this tea shoot is comprised of a bud. That's the top part, the top growing part of the shoot, and then followed by a series of new to newish leaves going down to what we call the mother leaf or the maintenance leaves, right? And so depending on how far you pluck down that shoot, you might get different characteristics of flavor, of color, and other sensorials. And so when you want a very flavorful tea, you might go for what we call a fine pluck or even an imperial pluck, which would be the first leaf in a bud or the first two leaves in the bud. And then as you move down, you will get more and more towards what you call a coarse pluck that will have less of the flavor characteristics, but maybe more of the color characteristics. So that in a nutshell is how the harvesting practices can influence the tea. And then finally, and maybe less surprisingly, the way the tea is processed really defines further what the outcome in terms of what tea you're producing. And I say processing, but it's really a craft. There's not many more variables in play than time and temperature and air exposure, right? But the different combinations of would deliver the whole variety of teas. So for example, in the production of green tea, you would stop the oxidation of the leaf. So you would stop that natural process where the leaf would start to turn black, a little bit like when you leave a banana exposed to air or an avocado exposed to air. That same enzyme is present in tea leaves. And if you manage to stop it by applying a heat step, then the tea remains green. If you, on the other hand, allow it to continue to oxidize, you will have a black tea, for example. And then there's a series of other intermediate steps, such as rolling, sweltering, post-fermentation that would give you all the other types of teas as well, white, oolong, pu'er, what have you. Just to take you through a quick carousel of pictures on what a typical black tea process would be. So in this case, we're talking about a CTC process, so a process making tea that's suitable for tea bags. So obviously the tea would be transported from the tea field. So typically the factories are within very close proximity because you want the process to be as fast as possible and damage the leaves the least as possible. So the tea is immediately after picking transported to reception and allowed to wither. So that's the first step where the magic happens, right? Withering is a process whereby the leaf is left to sort of wilt over a number of hours, and that's where the first biochemical processes happen within the tea leaf that will define your end profile. And then after that, the tea goes through a series of maceration, cutting, and rolling, and then in the case of black tea, left to oxidize. So again, this process is carried out by an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, which is the exact same enzyme that turns your avocado black. And you can see in the pictures how it turns from this beautiful green matter to these to black tea through coppery colors, and this is a very important moment as well in building some of the flavor profiles. Once the achieved oxidation is reached, you block the entire process by forwarding the tea onto a drying stage. Still happens prevalently through wood drying contraptions, and then finally cleaned from the fiber or pieces of stalk that might have been residual in the process. After that, the tea coming out of the dryer gets sieved or graded, as we said, so it gets separated in different sort of fractions that might have different preferences, different market values across different regions. In some areas of the world, dusty teas are appreciated more. In other areas of the world, the local preference might be for a larger leaf. So the teas are sort of separated that way, and then even the stalks and the fibers that are separated have their own application in maybe making tea powders or extracts and so forth. And then there's a final sort of quality control that's measures some physical and chemical properties such as density, moisture, and then finally sort of the cupping or the tea tasting before packing into these paper bags normally. Once packed, the bags make their way to the auctions. That's still the way where a lot of tea is sold and bought. It still sort of obeys the laws of supply and demand, and gets sold at weekly auctions. Typically, so some of the major ones are in Mombasa, and some of the pictures here are relating to that. Mombasa takes care of most of the East African teas, and then there's other important auctions in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, several in India, one in Jakarta for the Southeast Asian teas. But this is where the tea gets auctioned off, bought by the different companies, and typically prior to that, each company prepares itself by tasting thousands and thousands of cups just prior to the auction, so that they come prepared and are able to bid the price they feel is correct, right? A quick mention to sustainability. Sustainability in tea is really important. It's still cultivated in some very rural areas of the globe, and to ensure longevity of the tea business, you need to make sure that the working conditions are respected, that the necessary economical benefits are trickling down the whole value chain, and then of course that the environment is maintained as well. It's really paramount, because tea often sort of benefits of certain very delicate ecosystems, so you want to make sure that those are preserved as much as possible. And there's a slew of organizations that oversee that. Some of them are listed on this slide, and I wanted to maybe deep dive a little bit more into one of them. So I chose Rainforest Alliance amongst some of these certifying groups, just because I think they have a good breadth of action, right? They cover the three main pillars of sustainability, which are the environmental leg, the social equity leg, and the economic viability leg, right? So each of these three need to be sort of covered to ensure a holistic, sustainable, practice. So Rainforest Alliance currently certifies just short of a million different estates. So tea is still cultivated by smallholders a lot. So hence the large number of estates that actually apply to this program. Which equivalates to just under 3 million acres, and then they have a serious evaluation criteria, and I thought it'd be interesting to give some more sort of practical examples of what I've seen. So, for example, under the environmental leg, I ran into this beautiful waterfall on the left of this slide, which is in Argentina, the north part of Argentina, Misiones, where they grow a lot of the tea that makes its way to this region. Beautiful, beautiful setting. And the farmer was mentioning, the farmer that has his fields in proximity of this waterfall said, before the Rainforest Alliance came, this waterfall used to run completely red. It was covered, it was completely saturated in silt and mud because of the erosion there. It's a very there's a lot of precipitation in that part of the world. And one of the evaluation criteria of Rainforest Alliance is to create some buffer areas between the fields and the water bodies with indigenous plants, and since that was applied, the water started running clear again, which I thought was a really sort of exemplary sort of episode. But so I brought it here, and then also showing a couple of other sort of initiatives that they carry forward. So the pictures of the monkeys here are two separate sort of conservation projects. The one on the left is in Kenya, where they sort of protect the wildlife. In this case, it's the colobus monkeys, and in East Java, West Java rather, there's a program to protect the local fauna. In this case, it was the Java gibbon. So a lot of conservation projects go hand in hand with some of these organizations, and also there's a big push to make them self-sufficient in terms of energy management as well. Of course, tea grows where there's a lot of water bodies typically, and that's that's energy is harnessed in the form of hydroelectric power and making them effectively off the grid, which is good. The social aspect, maybe the most important one, a lot of the communities around tea growing live in very close proximity to the fields. Hence, a lot of emphasis from some of these organizations is around providing housing, providing access to schooling, welfare services, education, safe and drinking water, all essentials in our eyes, but not always a given in some parts of the world. So really important part of the program is to oversee this. And then finally, the economic viability leg, and this is where sort of the whole program can survive only if at the end the farmer is getting more value out of this crop. So this is where Rainforest Alliance gives a lot of a lot of tuition and helping develop higher yield crops for the farmers, higher quality yield, higher quality crops. Maybe using drought resistant varieties or training the farmers to improve their agricultural techniques, including pruning, including fertilizing, plucking, etc., etc. So there's an element of training that's really important to improve the agricultural standards. And essentially, I think this is where Rainforest Alliance sort of differentiates itself from other certifying bodies. So these were just a few examples that I wanted to bring through from one of the sustainability brands, but others have equally good programs. The bottom message that I wanted to bring across was that sustainability is an extremely sort of important aspect of tea growing. Just wanted to finish off by mentioning some emerging trends in tea. We see a lot of emphasis on organic. Consumers are more and more aware of the benefits of organic farming. Cold brew is also something that we see a lot. Matcha is now a very established trend, almost turning into mainstream at this point. We see popping up of unconventional origins like Australia, Colombia, even in the US. There's some fairly recent activities in Hawaii, and tea is becoming more experiential in that way. People are starting to enjoy tea rituals, like Gong Fu Cha or the Chinese tea drinking rituals. And some of the cult teas are getting more and more traction. You see more of these pu'ers knocking around, and a variety of other specialty teas. We see a lot of lattes, I guess mainly as a consequence of the pandemic as well. People are enjoying those cafe experiences that they used to at home. So you see a lot of lattes, boba teas, cheese teas. So quite a lot of that in trends. And then as well, tea becoming again more experiential with food pairings. Cooking with tea is more and more sort of common to see. And I think that was it from my side. I'll pass the floor on to Dr. Dubose at this point. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know if you have any questions in the section.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I do think you have quite a few questions coming in if you want to take a look. So I'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to dig a little deeper into some of this was already covered, but more on the nutrition side of the benefits of drinking tea. As Alex has already mentioned, tea is the second most consumed beverage in the world next to water. And we're going to explain that a little more as to some of those aspects. What naturally occurs in tea is caffeine. It's actually one of the lowest caffeinated beverages. If you look at the range there provided by USDA, I know as registered dietitians, we often get asked about caffeine content. And like I noted, it's one of the lower caffeine beverages on the market, relatively low compared to some of your stronger coffees for sure. It's really capping out at about 50 milligrams per 8-ounce cup. But there is also decaffeinated options that are available on the market. Theanine is, I'm not sure if you've heard of theanine, but it's a unique amino acid that tea naturally provides some unique benefits there. And then the heart of what we're going to talk about is really the flavonoid content. And that's really where the benefit is coming from. So hopefully you've heard of what flavonoids are. They're naturally occurring compounds found in tea. Tea is actually one of the best sources in the diet, and there's research to indicate based on consumption patterns, but also based on the amount that's being delivered per cup of tea. And if you look at the way that flavonoids are classified, you find them naturally, as I mentioned, in other food components and beverages like fruits, vegetables, wine. And you can see an array there of where you find your flavonoids and how they're grouped. What's really notable for tea is it's a big deliverer of what we call the Flavan-3-ols. And that's really where you'll find the concentration of flavonoids within your tea products, both hot and cold. And so within that, again, as noted, tea's a top source of flavonoids in the diet. It's really responsible for some of those sensory attributes that Alex went through, the color, the taste, the astringency. Typically, when you let your tea bag sit in the hot water, you're pulling out more of those flavonoids and you get more of that bitter, astringent taste to the tea. I also get question on, okay, well, what if, here in the US, we may not do it as much, the Brits may, but regardless, if you're adding milk, does that affect the bioavailability of the absorption of these flavonoids from your tea? And there's research to indicate that if you add up to 25%, you're still getting some of those flavonoids available to you through your absorption process. So what's important here, many of you know February is American Heart Month, so we really wanted to bring awareness around cardiovascular disease. It's a number of conditions that unfortunately is the #1 killer, both here in the US as well as globally. Nearly 50% of all adults have some form of cardiovascular disease, and I'm afraid those numbers are going to continue to increase given the pandemic that we're living through. 1 in 3 deaths occur in the US because of cardiovascular disease. And then you can see the toll it takes, not just from a physical and mental aspect as an individual and on the family, but also from a financial aspect and the cost that it's costing our healthcare system. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to note was there's been a long, and you're going to hear a lot more about this from Taylor, but there's been a long-standing research effort to really explore these flavonoids and potential health benefits. And that's what this is really, just years of research in one slide, unfortunately, that's really giving you a snapshot of the benefit of these flavonoids. So basically from all sources within your diet, but what do they actually do and the benefits they provide, and specifically noting here on cardiovascular disease. So to sum it up, and unfortunately, like I said, summing it up in one slide on years of research, what we know is that the more flavonoids that you have in the diet, so, you know, going back to all the recommendations we give the public with regards to eating more fruits and vegetables and variety, unsweetened tea should be part of that, because as you increase your consumption of these flavonoids, we know they actually really reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. And that's what's really noted here from recent research, that compared to lower intakes, the higher consumption is decreasing that risk. And you see that nice dose-response relationship with the straight line there, showing that with every increase of 100 milligrams per day, you're really decreasing that risk from all-cause mortality as well as CVD or cardiovascular disease mortality between 4 and 6%. And then noted here is more on the stroke side, you'll see from another meta-analysis that was done that really in the dose-response relationship, you can lower your risk of stroke per that 100 milligrams per day by about 0.91 or 9% in lowering that risk. So we'll talk about what a cup of tea is really delivering in a flavonoid. You can see why tea is such a great choice for delivering those flavonoids in the diet. And so with that, you may have noticed that Lipid has, over the past year now, made a front of pack claim that drinking unsweetened green or black brewed tea can help support a healthy heart. And that can be both black or green. I know sometimes green kind of gets that healthy halo effect, but black tea also provides these benefits, as well as whether you consume it hot or cold. And so with that, we looked at the overall arching evidence, not just from total flavonoids in the diet, but specific to tea as the deliverer of those flavonoids, that there's consistent evidence that really demonstrates that inverse relationship between this overall flavonoid consumption and really reducing your risk of specific endpoints, as well as the totality of, unfortunately, death that would result from cardiovascular disease. And then we also looked at population-based studies, which are, based on meta-analyses, which were done, which Taylor again will address more specifically in a moment. But as I noted, those Flavan-3-ols are where we feel is really the deliverer of the subgroup of flavonoids that are really providing that benefit. So as noted, we're making that claim on pack, can help support a healthy heart. And then to be a little more prescriptive on it, we recommend daily consumption of 2 to 3 cups. And that's really because if you will note that we're really delivering at 2 to 3 cups, about 200 to 500 milligrams of flavonoids. So an 8-ounce cup of green tea is going to give you 150 milligrams per cup, and black tea will provide about 170 milligrams per cup. The flavonoid contents can vary, but if what I had noted on the previous slide is that sweet spot of 100 milligrams per cup that you're getting that decrease. So with that, you'll see that the risk really does go down in drinking 2 to 3 cups, because when you look at the data, it's actually around between 300 and 500, you start to see that reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. One other note that we looked at that I thought was interesting, and this is published research, is do unsweetened tea drinkers have healthier diets? And what we found out is the bottom line is yes. In fact, those who drink unsweetened tea have an overall, if you will, healthier eating index. So they're eating, the food groups we know that are important, and they reduce their risk in that sense, but also they've got lower amounts of added sugar and alcohol in the diet. And overall, there's an association with drinking unsweetened tea with the better HDL or good cholesterol, as well as a lower body weight. So overall, unsweetened tea is really a great beverage choice. Next slide, please. And so that's what we just noted in the new 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. They referenced unsweetened tea as a really good option for consumers. You can see 2 highlights that I pulled out from the DGAs right there at the top next to water. You have your unsweetened tea, again, 0 calories, no sugar, and then we know these all important flavonoids that are being delivered. And then of course they showcased it with regards to nutrient dense meals, with your beverage option being so important as well, as it is a contributor of calories and nutrients in the diet. But in this case, providing 0 calories and again, those important flavonoids that you can get. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to really call out, Lipton is now a proud sponsor of the American Heart Association's Life is Why program. Together, we really hope to inspire Americans to really care for their heart in easy, accessible ways, such as through a heart healthy diet, which does incorporate unsweetened green or black brewed tea. And so you'll start to see the American Heart Association's logo, the Life is Why logo on pack, as well as a lot of our assets that we'll be rolling out within the stores, on commercials, in magazines, to really bring attention on the importance of caring for your heart and really driving awareness on American Heart Association and all that they provide, but also for American Heart Month in February. And so finally, I just want to wrap it up and showcase one more time, unsweetened tea is a really great option. As noted by the DGAs, there's a lot of evidence with regards to the inverse relationship between consumption of unsweetened tea and all-cause and CVD mortality. And it's actually just as hydrating as water, because tea is 99.5% water, with those other solids being flavonoids. I wanted to call out, we have additional references and resources on our website. We have a wonderful tea and health toolkit where you'll be able to access all this research I just quickly ran through, as well as Taylor's work. And then very new is our communications toolkit, which is really ideal for spreading the word on social media. That is now on our website with different graphics that you can use to post socially. So I would encourage you all to check out that website. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me as well. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Taylor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joy. So like Dr. DeBow said, I'm Taylor Wallace. I have my own research firm called Think Healthy Group, and I'm also adjunct faculty at George Mason University. These are just a few of my conflicts of interest up front. We did receive research funding for our research on tea from Unilever, which does own the Lipton brand, as well as several other brands. You can find out all about my conflicts of interest on my website, drtaylorwallace.com. And so we've already kind of heard a little bit of background on tea, and as we were going through the presentation slides, I kind of feel like it's a better utility for maybe me to address some of the more potent questions that I've seen rather than repeat the slides over and over again. There were a couple questions about GMO-free tea. In the US, there are only 11 GMO foods, and tea is not one of them. So tea in the US is actually GMO-free. We also had a question on the flavonoids, which we'll get to in just a moment. It's a big part of our research about the bioavailability of the flavonoids if you had sugar in your tea. Flavonoids are actually known to bind and block carbohydrate absorption. In fact, in the 1960s, we knew of flavonoids as, quote, anti-nutrients because they have the ability to prevent carbohydrate absorption. So actually the exact opposite is true. Flavonoids in tea have that ability to bind carbohydrates and prevent them from being absorbed. The final question I'll go through, and then I'll get through my introduction, was a great question about the benefits of decaffeinated tea. And in our research, we don't really see any differences in decaffeinated versus caffeinated tea. A couple people mentioned several birth defects that might be related to caffeine intake, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, as well as the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, recommend that pregnant women consume less than 200 milligrams of caffeine per day. And so, as you can probably do the math from the former speaker's slides, that's quite a lot of tea that you would have to consume to reach those levels. So just some few things to keep in mind so I'm not repeating myself. We've talked about tea being used in traditional Chinese medicine, and that tea is an excellent source of these flavonoids, which are very strong antioxidants in the body. Dr. DeBow talked a little bit about flavonoids. Tea contains a group of flavonoids known as the Flavan-3-ols or Flavanols. These have really been shown to influence cardiovascular disease, particularly among observational studies, which is a big part of our research. So we also, why research tea? Tea is practical. As a nutrition scientist, we often have a problem getting people to eat healthy. Get your 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, a certain amount of whole grains, but people don't really comply to diets. However, they do better accept small changes. So instead of telling people what not to eat, telling people what to eat usually equals a better outcome. And so having someone introduce a cup of unsweet tea per day can be a pretty practical means that has substantial benefits to cardiovascular disease. So in the last year, we've undertaken 2 large systematic reviews. First with cardiovascular outcomes, right? We want to look at heart outcomes like mortality, events like heart attacks and strokes. And then the second systematic review, we want to dig down a little bit deeper into why we might be seeing some of these effects on those hard outcomes of cardiovascular mortality, heart attacks, stroke events, and such. We use the National Academy of Medicine standards for conducting systematic reviews. I won't get into the specific methodology behind systematic reviews because it is pretty standardized. But we do use the AmStar 2 guidelines, which are quality ratings for systematic reviews, and we make sure we check all those boxes as we go through the process. So let me start with our first systematic review on the hard outcomes. We gathered data from 39 prospective cohort studies. These are large observational studies. And we looked at all-cause mortality. We found all-cause mortality as an outcome in 15 of those studies included this in the systematic review. 19 studies measured cardiovascular mortality. 7 measured cardiovascular events like heart attacks, and 13 measured stroke events. Most studies reported multiple outcomes of interest, as you can imagine. And 8 of these studies didn't have sufficient data to be included in the meta-analysis. We did include them in our systematic review, but we couldn't extract enough data to actually crunch that data together with all of the other studies. So each cup of tea was associated with an average of 1.5% lower risk of all-cause mortality, 4% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality, 2% lower risk of cardiovascular events, and 4% lower risk of stroke events. Now, this is per cup. So, if you were drinking 2 cups of tea per day, you would see a 3% lower risk in all-cause mortality, and so on. And in our studies, as I'll explain, we really didn't have a lot of data. There's not a lot of people that consume more than 8 6 to 8 cups of tea per day. So the data really in that dose response, really 6 cups is about as high as we can be confident that that data will go. But you can do the math on that. Just something simple as a cup of tea can have a fairly big impact if you're drinking it consistently. So these are what's called our dose response curves. You can see on the left of your screen for all-cause mortality. The gray areas represent the 95% confidence interval. You can see, again, towards that 1,500 milligrams per day of flavonoids. Keep in mind, a cup of tea has about 200 milligrams of flavonoids, 200 to 250. Don't necessarily think because the curve starts going up, after that 1,500 milligrams that it's harmful. That's just basically that we don't have much data. And so the confidence intervals get really wide right there. So as you can see, about up to 6 to 8 cups a day, we're showing decreases in all-cause mortality. You can see the individual studies lined up in what we call a forest plot on the right side of the screen. And you can see the data is pretty consistent, right? All of those studies fall on the same side of the line. The black line in the center represents a null effect. And you can see that most of the studies fall on the side of benefit when it comes to all-cause mortality. So that's nice. We're fairly confident because we have consistency within our results. The same goes for cardiovascular mortality. You can see the dose response on the left, noting not a lot of data above that 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams of flavonoids per day. And then again, on the right side, once again, those studies really showing consistency in the effects shown. Cardiovascular events, you'll see a little tighter confidence interval. And you'll notice that on the on the right side, you'll see those little gray boxes, the squares around the dots. That shows how much each study weighs into the meta-analysis. So you'll see a lot of these population sizes are larger, right? It's harder. Not as many people die of cardiovascular mortality as the number of people that have heart attacks or different events. So it's not surprising that our confidence intervals are a little bit tighter on the left side of your screen. And then finally, stroke events. This one, again, that 12 to 1,500 is really when our data starts to get a little bit scanty. And so, it might over dramatize the effect at higher levels of intake past that 6 to 8 cups a day of tea. But again, notice on the right-hand side where those studies are pretty much lining up in the benefit. So one of the things that I was very pleased with is you see a lot of consistency in the data, and that's not really typical in nutrition science. A lot of times things get very hodgepodged and confounded in nutrition science. The studies don't always really consistently say the same thing, but in this case, the data is fairly consistent. Now, we used a strength of evidence grading tool. This is based on the evidence to date. So if there is not a lot of evidence available, you'll get a lower strength of evidence. So in this case, all of these studies were observational, which means there wasn't a lot of randomized control trials, or there weren't any randomized control trials that measure death and mortality, right? Because those studies would be expensive to run for 20 years to look at incidence of death or incidence of heart attacks. And so you have very low quality data just based on there's just observational evidence to date. Now, if you'll notice, particularly when it comes to CVD mortality, you do have moderate evidence, which means that if a new large clinical trial were to publish, it's not really likely to influence the direction of the meta-analysis. And you see it moderate in elderly individuals. Now, why is that? It's simply because elderly individuals tend to have more heart attacks, right? So if you look at population studies and you have 30,000 people, if it's a population of 40, 50-year-olds, only some, there's a lot of cohorts that are 40 to 60 years old, you don't expect to see a lot of heart attacks or cardiovascular death in that group. So that really lowers the strength of evidence when we just talk about the general healthy population quote, because the general healthy population we consider from 18 to 85 plus. And really you don't see heart attacks until you get in that 65 plus age group. So the evidence is a little bit lower in the general population as it would be in the older population when it comes to those observational findings. And we also know that dietary patterns matter, right? So, if you have a horrible diet and you don't exercise, consuming 1 cup of tea per day probably is not going to give you a huge benefit, but a cup of tea in relation to all around good diet, we know really can show much larger effects. And in nutrition science, we have this tendency to look at things in isolation. Is it a calcium supplement that prevents osteoporosis, or is it a cup of tea that prevents heart disease? But it's really about that whole diet and that whole lifestyle that we need to be looking at. And so tea is a component of that healthy lifestyle. It's also really hard to show confounders in observational studies. So, tea drinkers might exhibit other healthy habits, or they might exhibit detrimental habits. So people drinking unsweet tea might have higher consumption of fruits and vegetables. They might be more physically active. On the contrary, people drinking sweet tea might be eating more cheeseburgers and French fries every day. And that's really hard to tease out when you just look at observational studies. And that's why randomized controlled trials are so important. Okay, so let's talk mechanisms. We've looked at blood lipids like total and LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, another validated marker of cardiovascular disease. We've also had a lot of recent work looking at endothelial function and improvements in blood flow. We look at cross-communicating proteins and inflammation. We know flavonoids in tea are very good at regulating inflammation. And then finally, the gut microbiome. You really are what you eat, and we'll get into that in just a second. Okay, so our second systematic review looked at 14 randomized controlled trials. So I told you that there weren't any randomized controlled trials that measured heart attacks or death from cardiovascular disease, but there are ones that measure effects on lipids and blood pressure and some of those markers that change within 3 to 4 weeks. Most studies had insignificant sample sizes, and that was really a detriment to our study. As you'll see, we really didn't find any significant effects on blood lipids and blood pressure, but there weren't enough individuals in the study to show small changes in blood lipids and blood pressure. So these are, I would say, lower quality of evidence just in general because of the small sample sizes. And you can see in regards to the blood lipids as well as blood pressure, just due to the very small amount, see how little and tiny those gray boxes are? That shows you, we had, some studies that had, 11 and 12 people in there, and to monitor, a change in, 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury of blood pressure, it is impossible to do with such a small sample size. So, I want to jump into a really exciting area that we're looking forward to really getting into. There's been a lot of data with flavonoids and tea in regard to endothelial function. And endothelial cells line your arteries. And I kind of think about your arteries as a rubber band. You might have heard of nitric oxide as something that you get a lot of when you smoke a cigarette. And it's one of the reasons people crave cigarettes. Well, you get a lot of nitric oxide from that cigarette and your veins dilate, that rubber band stretches. But what happens when you get a lot of it? It eventually collapses, and that's when you crave another cigarette. Fruits and vegetables and other plant-based foods, these flavonoids stimulate nitric oxide, but from these endothelial cells that line your arteries. And what that does is it makes that rubber band dilate to, you know, a really optimal position to where it doesn't really collapse. And so that promotes very healthy blood flow. You know, if your veins are dilated, but they're not overextended, you've got nice blood flow going. That's very much related to cardiovascular health. And we know that tea consumption has been shown to improve flow-mediated dilation, or that dilation of the veins, by about 2.6%. And just a 1% change in flow-mediated dilation can reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease by 10%. So just think, tea consumption could potentially decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease by, you know, 26%, just in looking at endothelial function and flow-mediated dilation, which is a really, really novel new area of research. I talked a little bit about inflammation already, but inflammation really refers to the body's process of fighting things off that harm it. And so when something damages your cells, maybe you have a diet high in saturated fat or added sugar, maybe you don't exercise, you get a lot of inflammation and a response from the immune system. And flavonoids are really known to positively influence that by regulating some of those inflammatory pathways. And so I've given you NRF2 and NF-kappa B, which flavonoids seem to fairly strongly influence. So that's another really exciting area of research that we're currently getting into, and we'll be publishing on that fairly soon. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the microbiome. Again, you are what you eat. The microbiome has been known to metabolize flavonoids and break them down into smaller compounds that can exert a biological effect in relation to cardiovascular disease and overall health. You know, it's not necessarily really those big molecules that cross the intestinal lining, but it's the breakdown products. And these, like flavonoids, can help select for good bacteria in your colon. So it's not only the bacteria benefiting the flavonoids and fermenting them and breaking them down, but it's the flavonoids helping to select for good bacteria to grow in your colon. And so this is a slide. This is a fairly older study, but I think it's really important. And I show you in the red circle, when you get to be about 50 to 60 years old, you start seeing an increase in the number of pathogens, particularly Clostridia and E. coli that habitat your colon. And so the idea is, with things like tea and flavonoids and different probiotic kind of foods, or prebiotic foods, excuse me, that you would be able to you know, push that off, because at the same time you start seeing rises in LDL cholesterol, blood pressure. And so if we can shift that microbiome to where you see the increased pathogens, you know, 10 years down the line instead of at 50 years old, maybe you start to see it at 60 years old. Can we offset cardiovascular disease and some of these other chronic ailments? It's a really fascinating area of research that we're getting into. And our group's even looking at these bacteria-specific viruses called bacteriophages to see if we can selectively knock out some of these bacteria using viruses that are selective only to specific bacteria. But tea is another, again, a potentially a good way to do this as well. So in conclusion, unsweet tea consumption seems to decrease the incidence of cardiovascular disease-related mortality and events like heart attacks, but the biological mechanisms are likely multifactorial. It's not just about LDL cholesterol or blood pressure. They probably exert numerous effects on the body, and those small things add up, and that's why you see the outcomes that you do in observational studies. And so we're still investigating a lot of this, and we do need randomized control trials with sufficient sample size for that. And we're really excited for the future. And so with that, I think all of the panelists and I will take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of our panelists. I know we're basically out of time right now. There was a question that came up a few times. I was wondering if you could clarify, Dr. Taylor-Wallace, about defining a cup of tea. Some people are saying they use one tea bag over multiple cups of liquid, or are you talking about multiple tea bags? If you could clarify.
So for our purposes, 1 cup of tea was 8 ounces of tea, or 1 cup. It was also 1 tea bag for all practical purposes. Now, if the amount of flavonoids in the tea depends on, how long you steep it in the hot water, so it can actually vary quite a bit depending on, several things, how the tea was processed, how long it was steeped, things like that. But for our intensive purposes, for research, generally it's been 1 tea bag or 8 ounces of tea, and that's black or green. Our data incorporate both.
Great, thank you for clarifying. And to clarify, that did that or did that not include herbal teas, or just black and green?
No, so we only looked at tea from Camellia sinensis, which is black and green tea. We could have looked at oolong tea, but we did not find any studies of oolong tea. It was just black and green.
All right, well, thank you all so much for your time today.
I should also mention,
go ahead.
I should also mention our research also incorporated both sweet and unsweet tea. We didn't have the ability to separate those out in studies. So there is a chance that our results are under exaggerated and offset by the added sugar that's present in a lot of tea. And while we recommend unsweet tea as nutrition scientists, our data is reflective of both unsweet and sweet tea combined.
Great, thank you. So just a reminder to everyone that we will be emailing you the recording and the slides within 1 week, as well as the certificates of attendance. And with that, I would just like to say thank you once again to Unilever and to all of our panelists. And we hope you join us at a future webinar. Thank you.